lesson for today.
So the first lesson is from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and I'm going to read from the Good News translation. So if you're trying to follow along in the Bible, I'm not just making it up. I may be able to speak the languages of human beings and even of angels, but if I have no love, my speech is no more than a noisy gong or a clanging bell. I may have the gift of inspired preaching. I may have all knowledge and understand all secrets. I may have the faith needed to move mountains, but if I have no love, I am nothing. I may give away everything I have, even give up my body to be burned, but if I have no love, this does me no good. Love is patient and kind. It's not jealous or conceited or proud. Love is not ill-mannered or selfish or irritable. Love does not keep a record of wrongs. Love is not happy with evil, but is happy with the truth. Love never gives up, and its faith, hope, and patience will never fail. Love is eternal. There are inspired messages, but they are temporary. There are gifts of speaking in strange tongues, but they will cease. There is knowledge, but it will pass. For our gifts of knowledge and of inspired messages are only partial. But when what is perfect comes, then what is partial will disappear. When I was a child, my speech, feelings, and thinking were all those of a child. Now that I'm adult, I have no more use for childish ways. What we see now is like a dim image in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. What I know now is only partial. Then it will be complete as God's knowledge of me. Meanwhile, these three remain: faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love.
Wow, the fourth week of Advent. It's been a quick journey for me. We started weeks ago with this theme of hope, that in Christ's resurrection we get a glimpse of what's to come, the fulfillment of God's promise to make all things new, to reconcile things to himself. That hope is our destiny, but it's also the path that we walk. Hope is like an immunization shot against despair or against cynicism. Sometimes we can think cynically, well, everyone else in the world just seeks their own well-being. Why shouldn't I? The other guy's only trying to get ahead for himself. Why shouldn't I? Well, I don't. Immunized by hope. And then we talked about peace. Christ's peace, given not as the world gives peace, but peace that no matter what's going on around us, we can place it in a larger story. That story formed by hope on either end. Peace that doesn't close its eyes or deny the hardships of the world around us, but moves through them, anchored in that hope that all things will be made right. And then last week, we talked about joy. Joy is that sensation of being caught up in something much greater than ourselves, something more powerful than ourselves. Something that can maybe leave us feeling vulnerable, but also it always has these two qualities with it. An absolute trust in that thing of which we are a part, and also delight in it. You can think as a good image of joy, a toddler being tossed up in the air by an uncle or a loved one, and they're just thrilled. They know that they're not in control of this moment. They're just a part of what's happening here, but they have full trust and delight, excitement. That's joy. Well, and now we come to love, the final one. Our gospel lesson comes from John's gospel. It comes from chapter 15. This is in the last days of Jesus' interaction with his disciples in the world, in this world, and he's repeating things he wants them to know, driving the point home. So John 15, starting at verse 9. It says, "As the Father loved me, so I've loved you. So now remain in that love. If you keep my commandments, then you will remain in that love. That's how I do it. Keep the Father's command, and I remain in his love. And I've told you this so that my joy can be in you and that your joy will be full. And just so you remember, this is my command. Love each other, just like I loved you. And there is no greater love than this, than that you lay down your life for your friends. And you are my friends if you do what I tell you. I don't call you servants, because servants don't know what their master's business is. But I have called you my friends, for everything that I learned from the Father I've made known to you. You didn't choose me. I chose you, and I've appointed you, that you can go and bear fruit that'll last. And you can ask my Father in my name for whatever, and he'll give it to you. But again, remember, this is my command, that you love each other. The title for this week's sermon was inspired by my thinking this week of B.B. King's song, When Love Came to Town. In particular, I'm thinking of the version he sang with U2 on their 1988 Rattle and Hum album. I was a sailor, was lost at sea, was under the waves, but love rescued me. When love comes to town, I'm going to jump that train. When love comes to town, I'm going to catch that flame. Maybe I was wrong to ever let you down, but I did what I did before love came to town. King knows that love changes things. That song of his tells about a conversion experience of his own, being caught up by love. You know, in that beautiful passage that Mike read for us from 1 Corinthians 13, just before that, Paul was talking about how God has appointed the body with all types of gifts and abilities. He says these are all good and necessary and great things, but let me tell you the most excellent way, and that is love. And then he speaks about love. He talks about all these other abilities we had, as you heard Mike read it. We could have eloquence to speak. We'd have spiritual insight. We can have knowledge. We could have profound faith and magnanimous generosity. But if those things lack love, then they don't even count. They're wasted. And it goes on, love is patient and kind. It's not jealous or conceited or proud. It's not ill-mannered or selfish or irritable. It doesn't keep any records of wrongs. Love is not happy with evil, but rather rejoices in the truth. Love never gives up. And it is faith and hope and patience never fail, for love is eternal. That's beautiful, isn't it? You know, just this past week, the world lost a great light. Her name was Gloria Watkins. You might have known her name that she wrote by bell hooks. She was an anthropologist of sort, a philosopher of some sort, an African-American woman, a professor of Appalachian Studies down at Berea College in Kentucky. She just passed away on Wednesday. But she said this about love. She says, it's especially hard to speak of love when what we have to say draws attention to the fact that lovelessness is more common than love. And that for many of us, we're not even sure what we mean when we talk about love or how to express it. Well, what do we mean when we talk about love? It's one of those words that is at home in any context, and yet it can take on meanings quick as you turn on a dime. Some of you might be familiar with C.S. Lewis's book, The Four Loves. He talks about 4 terms in Greek that are translated as love. There's actually more than 4 in Greek. They all get translated as love. And he's trying to draw the attention that there are different kinds of love, different instantiations of it. He talks about eros, which is erotic or passionate love, and philia, which is the love of friendship, and storge, which is this love between parent and child, or agape, which is selfless love for one's neighbor. Well, these are helpful distinctions, and they are true distinctions. There's a difference. We could say, when God says, love your neighbor. But we might say, well, don't love your neighbor's wife. At least not that way. These are meaningful distinctions. And yet, we sometimes can get into trouble a little bit in Christian circles by separating the desire of eros with the sacrifice of agape. We say that one is sensual, the other is sacrificial, one is sexual, the other is divine, one is fleshly, the other is godly, one is romantic and fleeting, the other is unconditional and lasting. Agape belongs to that selfless, godlike, unconditional love demonstrated by Christ, typified by the Good Samaritan. Whereas eros, well, it's a burning desire that's demonstrated by those cuddling couples that are in Hallmark Christmas, specials that you can find this time of year. Or perhaps even more so by the entanglements of heated bodies in less wholesome movies. But the too strong a distinction can get us in trouble. It's not a distinction found in the Old or New Testament. Because both eros and agape, one desires, the other serves, but wrapped up together, they both share one thing in common, and both can be divine. And I believe this, that all forms of love, that is healthy love, what's deserving of the true name, has this at its heart: a desire and an impulse and a drive to be united with the beloved, with the thing that is loved. To mesh together and have fates bound up one with another. Love seeks unity. Hope looks into the future. Peace gives us tranquility when things are wrong around us. Joy lifts us up, lets us know that we ourselves are part of what's good and true and beautiful in this world. But love always moves out of itself, always moves beyond itself, always seeks to be united with that thing that is love. Whether it be with our fellow citizens, when we unite in a common cause, or a unity of purpose, a unity of a destiny or lot, or, as in the case of marriage, bodily unity. I believe that human love is a good thing. And I like those romantic comedies and Hallmark Christmas specials. You know how they're all going to play out. But they all point to the same thing, and there is something about that romantic love, the fullness of marriage that is given to us, I think, as a symbol of God's love. And I say a symbol, not a sign. Signs just point to things, but symbols participate in them and manifest some of the reality. A menu points to potential food that you could order. But a family meal instantiates and participates in the unity of a family, of mutual affection and care, respect and delight, belonging one to another. And so marriage, I think, can do the same thing. It manifests and points to that love of God. This past week I was with a friend, and he was drawing attention to there's that one thing that many of us are uncomfortable with in church. And so we don't talk about it too much in church, and sometimes we drive it away from our shared life together, and that thing is mystery. We like to figure stuff out, to know it, name it, then we can control it and predict it. But mystery exists before we got here, it exists after we're gone, it envelops everything. As he was saying that, I thought about Ephesians 5, where the Apostle Paul is talking about domestic relationships, parents and children, and husbands and wives. And he gives some instruction to husbands, how they should relate to their wives. And then he quotes Genesis chapter 2, the one bit of scripture that's quoted in the Old, or it originates in the Old Testament, is quoted by Christ, and then shows up in the epistles. Again, Paul cites that. And then he gets distracted. His mind wanders off into the great mystery of the church's unity with Christ. Let me read this to you. He says, verse 25 of Ephesians 5, "Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. In this same way, you husbands, you ought to love your wives just like your own body. For those who love their wives love themselves. For after all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and they care for their body just as Christ does the church, for we're members of his body." And then the quote from Genesis, "For this reason, a man will leave his mother and father and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." This is a profound mystery. And then he catches himself. Oh, I'm talking about Christ and the church. But however, each of you, you must love your wives as you love yourself. There is something in that unity of marriage that is a mysterious bond of unity. And it points to that mysterious bond of Christ's union with the church. So those romantic movies, it's all right. They point to something real, the desire to be united and the instantiation of what that unity can be. Love doesn't just desire that unity. It works on its behalf. Like Paul says, you serve your wives, just like you care for a body, to feed and care for. Because true, full love desires that unity, and it also works on behalf of. It's motivated by service. It seeks the other's well-being and acts to help them thrive. And it knows, why does it do this? Well, because actually, it's kind of enlightened self-interest. Because our own well-being is wrapped up with the well-being of the others. Like we read a couple weeks ago, "Seek the peace and the prosperity in which you dwell, for it's on its peace and prosperity rests your own." And so it is with us. Sin is not some violation of an abstract or distant rule that we're not supposed to break. Sin is a transgression against that fabric of which we're all a part. The reality that in the fundamental truth, we ourselves are bound up with one another, a common cloth of mutual belonging. This is true even of the natural world that we're a part of. When we love and care for one another, when we love and care for the world around us, we love and care for ourselves. We're part of that. It's a universal unity. It's made complete in our connection through Christ and in creation. So sin is not just the violation of some moral code someplace. It's a violation of this universal mutual belonging. Let me tell you a story about that a little bit. It comes from a guy named Paul Brand. Paul Brand was a physician, devoted his whole life to studying the disease of leprosy and serving folks who had it. At one point, in the heyday of his career, he was the world's preeminent scholar on leprosy, and he was a remarkably sacrificial individual. Spent his whole life in India at a mission compound, a leper colony, where he loved and cared and served for the others around him. He had a teaching hospital there. Students from across India would come to live and work under Dr. Brand. He tells a story about one day he gets a knock at his door, and there in front of him and the doorway is a frumpled-looking guy, kind of short with a big nose and a scraggly beard, and he's dressed in a monk's habit, and in his hand is a carpet bag that holds everything the old man possesses. Paul Brand didn't know him, but he invited him in, asked him to tell him a bit about himself. His name was Pierre. And his story is this. He was born in a noble family in France, but during his late teen years had a conversion experience, decided to become a Catholic priest. So he did, and as a priest, he was, throughout the war years in World War II, he was involved in the French resistance. He helped smuggle Jews to safety. Later on, after the war, he became a public servant in Parliament. And France, especially Paris, was having trouble in those early days reorganizing itself. The ravages of the war and disorientation, and there were thousands of homeless. There were beggars. And in his work in Parliament, he tried to enact policies that would care for that. One winter that was particularly brutal, thousands died in the street, frozen to death. And he said, I've had enough. These noblemen, my colleagues in Parliament, can't rouse themselves enough to do anything, so I'm going to do something. And he went as a priest, as a brother, and he organized the beggars. He organized them first to not just do their daily scavenging in a haphazard way, but to rather organize it and do it together. He set up teams of folks that would go out and collect waste bottles and rags. And then he had them collect bricks, and they built a warehouse for themselves, and then secured contracts with restaurants and hospitals and organizations to collect their garbage and sort it out. And it was quite successful. But the key to it all was one other insight he had. He said that for these brothers, they became known as the Rag Pickers of Emmaus, and followed Abbe Pierre, was this, that they each had to find another homeless guy or another beggar worse off than themselves and make that person their responsibility. To have somebody else that they had to look after and care for and serve and help them thrive. Well, this really took off. But he had come to a crisis moment. They were so successful that there were no longer homeless guys in Paris. And some might say, we've done it. We've won. We've succeeded. Game over. But Father Pierre, he knew, no, this is an existential crisis. We have to find someone else to serve. He'd heard about Paul Brand's work in the leper colony, so he traveled thousands of miles, showed up at his door, and said, can you help me? We need to serve somewhere. Well, Paul thought about that. There was a tradition there at the teaching school that the students, med students, would take their lunch together in a common hostel, and if there happened to be a guest, Paul Brand would usually give them a little bit of time to introduce themselves so the students could meet them. So today he brought Abbe Pierre over. Now, he only spoke French, and the Indian students didn't understand French, and he began talking, and Dr. Brand tried to translate as he could, but Father Pierre got excited and was speaking quickly, telling about God's good work in this world. He couldn't keep up. Now, Paul Brand got uncomfortable because these students were busy. They were med students. They had a lot to do, a lot to learn. And they typically had tolerance of about 3 minutes for anybody. And at the end of 3 minutes, it would start stomping their feet as a way of saying, you're done. Well, Abbe Pierre, in his French, which no one understood, kept talking. And he kept talking. He told about, if they could understand it, his time at the UN, hearing other dignitaries talk about the world's problems, but not often being able to agree on any way forward. He said they use great language, beautiful language, but love doesn't need to be understood. Love is a universal language, and its actions speak louder than the words themselves. Well, he went on for 20 minutes, and at the end of that time, the students stood up and they gave him an ovation. Afterwards, Dr. Brand asked one of the students, he said, what happened there? None of you understood what he was saying. He said, we didn't need to understand his words. Love was communicated, and we got that. Love. Love that seeks to be united with the beloved and to work on behalf of their fulfillment. That's the beautiful thing. Our closing hymn, there's a bit of a story behind this I want you to know a little bit about. It was written by a guy named Marcus Aurelius Clement Prudentius. What a great name. He was a lawyer in the late 300s. And towards the end of his life, he served Rome. Even he was appointed to the court and served them for a while. But in retirement, he became a monk, an ascetic. He would fast every day until sundown. And he was a poet. He wrote lots of different things, but one thing was poetry. And this hymn of a father's love begotten is a bit of poetry. It says this. He's making a theological point. At that time, there were different heresies afoot that said Christ isn't really fully God. This guy, Jesus, was not really God. One said are human. One said he was really God, but not really a person. He just put on human skin and pretended to be a person. That's called Docetism. The other, Arianism, just said this. No, he was just a really well-behaved human, so well-behaved that God liked him and adopted him. And the theologians who could see through that said, no, because the impulse of love wants unity with the beloved. And in the person of Christ, the human and the divine are united. Without that, well, there's no true unity with God. And so some people argued, some people were in prison, some people were exiled, some ridiculed, others, and many, like Prudentius, articulately and beautifully articulated, why does it matter that Christ was truly God and truly man? And so it begins, you see that first line, of the Father's love begotten. Ere the world began to be, he the Alpha and Omega, he the source and ending he, of all things that are, that have been, and that all the future years shall see, evermore and evermore. Let's go with that, affirming again the great news of Christmas, that God's love acts in such a way as to unite itself with all his creation in Christ. Amen.